My name's Sam, and I'm 52 years old. I run a small used car dealership, something I built from scratch with my own two hands. When I first started out, I didn't have much to my name, just a few $1,000s I'd managed to save while working in my dad's modest little garage. My dad passed away when I was barely out of high school, leaving me with almost nothing but the tools of his trade and the lessons he'd taught me. It wasn't much, but I held on to it and decided to carve out a life for myself. Those early years were tough. I spent countless days pulling double shifts, saving every dime I could manage. Slowly but surely, I turned an empty lot into what's now a proper dealership. I've never been rich, and I don't live in a mansion or drive anything flashy, but none of that's ever mattered much to me. I'm a simple guy. Folks around here know me, they trust me, and to me, that kind of reputation is worth a whole lot more than any luxury car or corner office view. And then there's Anna, my wife of 25 years. I met her way back at a friend's holiday party, one of those gatherings I never cared much for but went to because my buddy wouldn't take no for an answer. She was there with her friends, just finishing up her second year of law school. Right from the start, I could tell she wasn't like anyone I'd ever met, sharp, ambitious, and so stunning that heads turned the moment she walked into a room. Anna's story wasn't an easy one. She'd been raised by her grandmother after losing both her parents in a car accident when she was just a little girl. And just as she was finding her footing in college, her grandmother passed away, leaving her completely on her own. You could see that weight on her, the kind that shapes a person. We hit it off that night, talking for hours about life, our struggles, and what we wanted out of it all. She had these big, incredible dreams, and I honestly couldn't believe someone like her would even give me the time of day. But she did, and it just clicked. After we'd been dating for a while, she dropped a few hints that she was ready for something more serious. I picked up on it, saved up for a ring, and before long, I proposed. She said yes, and together, we started building a life. It wasn't some perfect fairy tale romance, but it was solid. I worked extra hours to support her through law school, covering tuition and living expenses so she could focus on her goals. After graduation, she landed a junior role at a small law firm and worked her way up from there while I kept growing my business. We had two boys, Adam and Connor, who are grown now and off living their own lives. For 25 years, I thought we were steady. Our marriage wasn't full of grand gestures or constant fireworks, but I believed we'd built something strong, something rooted in trust and hard work. To me, that's what marriage is all about, a steady partnership where both people show up for each other, day in and day out. At least, that's what I thought it was. Everything shifted last year when Anna landed a new job at a big-name law firm downtown. It was a huge step up, better pay, a fancier title, and one of those sleek offices perched high above the city with a view that could make anyone feel like they'd made it. She was over the moon about it. Her new boss, Matthew, was a high-profile attorney, the kind of guy who thrives in the limelight. He was always winning big cases, getting featured in the news, and even had his face plastered on a few billboards around town. At first, Anna couldn't stop talking about him. She'd gush about how smart he was, how driven, and how much she was learning under his mentorship. I didn't think much of it then. I figured she just admired him professionally. Why wouldn't she? We'd been married for over 2 decades, I had no reason to question her loyalty. But things started to shift, little by little. At first, it was so subtle I might have missed it if I weren't paying attention. She began dressing differently, trading her usual outfits for something sharper, more expensive looking. Sometimes, she'd come home with the faintest trace of a cologne that wasn't mine. When I'd ask her about her day, she'd shrug it off like it wasn't worth mentioning. Then her hours started stretching longer. More late nights at the office. More weekend events for work. She was glued to her phone, texting away with this small, secretive smile on her face. It wasn't long before she began stepping out of the room to take calls, lowering her voice and making sure I couldn't overhear. That's when I started wondering if there was more going on than just a busy new job. I'm not the kind of guy who jumps to conclusions, and I've never been the jealous type, but after spending over 2 decades with someone, you develop a sense for when things aren't right. You don't share that much time with someone and miss the small shifts in their behavior. Still, I chose to keep quiet and wait, hoping things would eventually settle back to normal. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. But the more I observed, the harder it became to ignore the signs. Whatever was going on, she wasn't even putting much effort into hiding it anymore. Weeks passed, and I reached my limit. One night, after she came home late from yet another work event, I decided it was time to confront her. I waited until she had settled, then calmly asked her if there was something she needed to tell me. I didn't raise my voice or throw accusations her way, I just asked the question outright. At first, she looked startled, like I had caught her off guard. She stammered a bit and tried to brush it off with excuses, but I didn't let up. I kept pressing, refusing to let her wiggle her way out of it. After about 30 minutes of back and forth, she finally admitted it. She said the words without much emotion, like she was mentioning something as trivial as forgetting to buy milk. She was seeing someone else. I asked her who it was, and that's when she finally said his name, Matthew. Her big-shot boss, the same man she'd been singing praises about for months. The way she said it, without hesitation or shame, left me stunned. The room felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out of it, but she wasn't done. She seemed ready to unload everything she'd been keeping from me. She told me she needed someone who matched her ambitions, someone who was on her level. According to her, I hadn't grown over the years, we had built a life, but apparently, I had stayed the same. I was too predictable, too comfortable in my small-town life. She, on the other hand, wanted more. She needed a man who could take charge, someone who shared her drive and could meet her lofty standards. Then came the part that hit the hardest. She called Matthew an alpha. She actually used that word, and it sounded rehearsed, like she'd heard it from him directly. She went on, her tone calm and matter-of-fact, as if she were explaining something obvious that I was too slow to grasp. Matthew, she said, was everything I wasn't. He was polished, ambitious, and capable of giving her the kind of life she believed she deserved. And me? I was just, not enough. She even made a point of glancing over my clothes, her eyes scanning my practical, no-frills outfit like it embarrassed her. Matthew, she said, was the kind of man who understood her vision, clean-cut, successful, and capable of providing for her in a way I apparently couldn't. That, she claimed, was what she deserved. I sat there, staring at her, feeling like I had stepped into a parallel universe. This woman, my wife of 25 years, was telling me that everything I had done for her, my loyalty, my hard work, the life I had built for our family, meant absolutely nothing. I hadn't leveled up, and that made me some small-town failure who no longer fit into her plans. Then she dropped what she must have thought was the grand solution. She suggested we stay married, for appearances. She could keep seeing Matthew, and I'd just have to accept it. She even used the word arrangement, like she was offering me some kind of business deal. And apparently, Matthew was all in on this plan. If you can't agree to it, she added, her eyes attempting some weak imitation of concern, Matthew has a team of 20 lawyers. He'll make sure you lose everything. She said it like she was doing me a favor, as if she was just giving me some friendly advice. The nerve of it all, she actually thought I should sit back and let her live this double life while I pretended everything was fine. I met her gaze and, without raising my voice or showing an ounce of anger, said, "Good luck." That's all I said. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, and I definitely didn't grovel. I stood up, left the room, and walked upstairs without looking back. She sat there, frozen, watching me go. Maybe she thought I'd beg, or maybe she expected me to fight for her, but I wasn't about to fight for someone who had already thrown away what we'd built. I had nothing left to say. As soon as I walked out of the room, she called him. Her voice was low and unsteady, like she was trying hard to control her emotions. "Yes, Matthew," she said softly. I told him everything. No, I didn't bother lying. I told him the truth, that I deserve better, that I need someone like you. A real man. There was a pause before I heard his voice faintly through the phone. Even from a distance, I could sense the arrogance dripping from his words. "You told him what we agreed, didn't you?" he asked, his tone smug. "That he's lucky to have kept you this long. That he's been less than satisfying." "Yes," she replied, though there was a hesitation in her voice. "But it wasn't easy. 25 years together, it's hard. Sam's been good to me. He supported me through law school, managed everything, raised our kids." Hearing her acknowledge that stung, making me feel a twinge of guilt. But then Matthew cut in, dismissing it all with a laugh. "Guilty? Come on, Anna. That guy's a joke. He's just some mechanic who's never had what it takes to give you the life you deserve. He's boring, small time. You need a real alpha to take care of you." "Yes, you're right," she said, though her voice still carried a hint of conflict. I told him all of that, but he barely reacted. He just said, "Good luck," and walked away. Matthew laughed again, this time louder, full of confidence. Walked away? He's going to have to get used to it. He'll learn his place soon enough. Then his voice shifted, dripping with pride. "You told me yourself, didn't you? You've never had it like this before. Didn't you say I've taken you places the old guy never could?" "Yes, I did," she admitted, her tone almost breathless. "But you have to understand, I didn't know that kind of passion when I married Sam. He's gentle, so different. You, though, you're demanding, bossy. It was overwhelming." "That's right," Matthew said smugly. "And I'll keep overwhelming you, sweetheart. You're with a real man now. I'm at the top, and he's just going to have to live with it." The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual. I couldn't stand the thought of sitting through more of her excuses or the pitying looks she'd started throwing my way, like I was some clueless fool who couldn't see the writing on the wall. She had made her choice, and if she thought I'd roll over and play along, she had no idea who she was dealing with. By noon, I was busy sorting through a new shipment at the lot when he showed up in person. Matthew strolled right into my office like he owned the place, decked out in one of those overpriced suits that probably cost more than my truck. He didn't bother waiting for an invitation, just plopped himself down across from me with a smirk that made my blood boil. "Sam," he said smoothly, leaning back in the chair like it was his throne. "I figured it was time we had a man-to-man chat. I could already tell this was going to be something." He started talking, his tone dripping with condescension, as if he were laying out a genius business strategy instead of the wreckage of my marriage. He went on and on about how he and Anna had found this deep, unparalleled connection, how they were true equals, and how he could provide for her in ways I never could. Then he fixed his eyes on me, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're a good guy, Sam. But men like me? We lead. We take charge," he said, pausing for effect. "You don't seem like the type to put up a fight, but let me spell it out for you. Anna wants to be with a real alpha, a man who knows how to handle things." I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I kept my expression calm and let him ramble. Matthew wasn't done, though. With a flourish, he pulled out a thick stack of papers and set them down on my desk, giving them a smug little tap. "Here's how it's going to go," Matthew said, flashing me that smug, condescending grin. He tapped the stack of papers on my desk like he was giving a rehearsed sales pitch. "Divorce papers, restraining orders, everything's here. Oh, and your wife's already signed, by the way. He paused, clearly enjoying every second of his performance, his grin widening as if he were savoring the power he thought he held over me. It's best for everyone if you just sign and keep things civil. No one wants any unnecessary unpleasantness. And let's face it, Sam, you don't want to be that guy who refuses to accept reality. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a mockingly sympathetic whisper. Besides, he said, his tone thick with false concern, this way, you get to hold on to whatever scraps of dignity you've got left. Anna's even willing to let you hang around on weekends, play the role of the loyal companion. It's not like she's going to cut you off entirely. Be smart about this, Sam. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. I stayed quiet, letting him ramble, giving him just enough silence to feel like he had the upper hand. He seemed to thrive on it, sitting there with that smug expression, like he'd already won. But the truth was, I was just waiting for the right moment. When he finally paused, thinking he'd wrapped things up neatly, I stood up. Slowly, deliberately, I stepped toward him, and before he could even process what was happening, I drove my fist straight into his arrogant face. The satisfying crunch of bone meeting bone was immediate. Matthew staggered back, his hands flying to his nose as blood began to drip down his chin. His eyes went wide, a mix of pain and disbelief washing over his face. He stumbled, clutching at his nose like he couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. That, I said, my voice steady and cold, was just the beginning. Before he could recover, I grabbed his collar and delivered a sharp uppercut to his gut. He doubled over, gasping for air, his body collapsing to the floor. He was sprawled out, clutching his stomach, struggling to catch his breath. I crouched down beside him, making sure he could see every ounce of anger and determination in my eyes. Let me teach you something about what a real man is, I said, my voice low and deliberate. A real man doesn't need to throw his weight around to feel important. He doesn't come into another man's space, try to steal his life, and call himself an alpha. A real man builds something of his own, stands by his family, and keeps his word. That's something you wouldn't understand if it hit you in the face, or maybe now you do. Matthew's face twisted in pain, but I wasn't about to let up. I stepped back, giving him just enough time to think the worst was over, to catch a sliver of hope that he was in the clear. And another thing, I said, pressing my boot down firmly on his outstretched hand. I could feel the bones crack beneath my weight as a sharp, guttural yell escaped his throat. He tried to pull his hand away, but I held it in place, unflinching. If you think you're going to run to the cops, go ahead. Let them take me in. Maybe I'll spend a few years behind bars, but when I get out, we'll have this conversation again. And next time, I won't be so nice. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He finally understood that his expensive suit and smug words wouldn't save him here. For the first time, he looked like a man who realized he wasn't untouchable, that his carefully curated image didn't make him invincible. Now get up, I said, stepping back. I watched as he struggled to his feet, cradling his broken nose with one hand and his crushed hand with the other. And get out of my sight. He didn't need to be told twice. He staggered out of my office, bloodied and broken, without so much as a backward glance. I followed him to the door, slamming it shut behind him. The rage that had been boiling inside me for days finally began to subside. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that afternoon, I overheard Anna calling Matthew. Her voice was sharp and anxious, with a hint of fear creeping in. I imagined she hadn't expected him to disappear for hours. If she thought this was all going to go according to their plan, she was in for a rude awakening. Matthew, Anna said, her voice laced with concern, I thought you'd be back by now. Where are you? His reply came through the line, muffled and strained. I'm in the hospital, he said flatly. The hospital, she repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. What happened? Were you in some kind of accident? Matthew's tone turned sharp and bitter. No, Anna. I went to talk to him, like we planned. Alone. And he broke my nose, fractured my right hand, cracked a couple of ribs, and maybe even my cheekbone. For the first time, his arrogance was gone, replaced with something closer to fear. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the bravado he usually carried like a shield. Anna was silent for a moment, her shock almost palpable. I don't believe it. Sam's never been violent. That's not who he is. Believe it, Matthew snapped. I've got the X-rays to prove it. He paused, then let out a bitter, painful chuckle. Your husband isn't as gentle as you thought. Her tone softened, tinged with guilt. Is there any way you can, not go to the police? Sam doesn't deserve to end up in prison over this. Matthew let out a long, weary sigh. The police have already been here, Anna. But I told them it was a hit and run. He warned me, if I pressed charges, he'd come after me when he got out. And you know what? I'm not taking that chance. Another pause hung between them before Anna's voice broke the silence, filled with disbelief. I can't believe it. Not my Sam. Matthew's voice darkened, resentment seeping into his words. You didn't see his face, Anna. He told me this was just the beginning if I didn't back off. I'm not risking my life to test him. She tried to steady her tone, but the desperation crept through. So that's it? After everything, you're just giving up? For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the line. Then Matthew's voice came back, cold and resigned. I don't have a choice. I'm doing what I need to do to survive. The line clicked as Matthew hung up, leaving Anna alone in the quiet. The reality of her so-called upgrade was crumbling right in front of her. The next day, Anna went to the hospital to see Matthew. She was a wreck, her hair thrown into a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes betraying her sleepless night. When she entered the recovery room, she found him propped up in bed, his face swollen and bruised, his arm in a cast. He looked up as she walked in, and for a moment, annoyance flashed in his eyes. Matthew, she began, her voice tense and hurried. You have to help me. I drove around for hours last night. I didn't know if it was safe to go home. I tried calling Sam to ask, but he wouldn't pick up. When I finally got the courage to go back, the locks were changed. Matthew just stared at her, the impatience clear on his battered face. She kept talking, desperation creeping into her voice. I stayed at my friend's place last night. This morning, I tried to check our bank accounts, and they're empty. None of my credit cards work. I need your help. Can you get one of the divorce attorneys at work to start the process of getting Sam out of the house? For a brief moment, Matthew looked like he might consider it. Then he shook his head, his expression hardening. No, he said flatly. No, she repeated, stunned. What do you mean, no? He sighed, the bitterness in his voice impossible to miss. If I use company resources to help you, it's just going to give your husband another reason to come after me. And I don't need that. In fact, I think it's best if I stay out of this completely. He shifted in the bed, wincing at the pain. I'll pay you an extra 4-week severance, Anna, but that's all. Pack up, leave today, and if you see Sam, tell him you were fired. That's the extent of what I'm willing to do. She stared at him, her mouth open in disbelief. Did you even hear me? Sam drained everything. I have no money, no job, nothing. And now you're telling me you won't help me either? Matthew's expression turned cold, unmoved by her desperation. I'm sorry, Anna, but you didn't see the look in your husband's eyes when he came after me. He's 10 times the man I'll ever be when it comes to that kind of strength. And honestly, I don't need a cheating wife in my life. We're done. Her shock morphed into fury, her eyes narrowing as she fixed him with a glare. You're pathetic, you know that? Yesterday, you were strutting around, bragging about being some kind of alpha male. Today, you're quaking in fear, worried Sam's hiding under your bed. She paused, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. How could I have ever thought leaving Sam for someone like you was a step up? You're nothing but a delusional coward. I can't believe I ever took you seriously. Matthew's eyes flickered with a mix of shame and anger, but he said nothing. She didn't wait for a response. Turning on her heel, she strode out of the room without sparing him a second glance, leaving him bruised, broken, and thoroughly defeated. Later that day, Anna sat alone in her car on the side of a quiet road, staring down at her phone and refreshing her banking apps. Every credit card she tried had been declined, and her accounts were empty. She had barely enough cash left to get through the day, and she knew her gas tank wouldn't take her much farther. I had made sure of that, ruthless, maybe, but necessary. I knew exactly where she was headed. She was making her way toward the town where our sons lived, probably hoping they'd take her in. Normally, they were quick to respond to her texts, rarely letting more than an hour pass without answering. But today, her phone was silent. Message after message went unanswered, leaving her staring at the blank screen with growing frustration. Eventually, she let out a heavy sigh, set the phone aside, and climbed out of the car. Straightening her wrinkled skirt, she walked over to the roadside and raised her thumb, hoping for a ride. A few minutes later, an old, beat-up van came rumbling down the road. As it slowed and pulled over, her eyes widened in panic. She froze as she recognized me behind the wheel. I stepped out, keeping my movements deliberate and calm, and gestured toward the passenger seat. "We need to talk," I said simply. She hesitated, her body rigid, but after a long moment, she climbed in, her eyes darting toward me like I was a stranger. She looked exhausted, worn down by the past few days. The stress had left its mark on her, aging her visibly. I didn't waste any time. "Here's what's going to happen," I began, my voice steady and firm. "You're going to file for divorce. There will be no alimony, no claims to my business or assets. Everything I have stays with me, and everything you have, or had, stays with you. Any jewelry I've given you will be returned. You can list any reason you want for the divorce, I don't care, as long as it's done." I paused, letting my words settle before continuing. "Once the divorce is finalized, you'll leave town. You won't contact me, and you won't show up at my house. If the kids want to see you, that'll be on their terms, and only when I'm not around. Tomorrow morning at 10, your things will be packed and waiting for you at the house. If they're not picked up by 11, they'll be burned. Are we clear?" She nodded slowly, her face pale and her eyes wide as she stared at me, like she couldn't quite believe the man sitting next to her was the same person she'd known for 25 years. When can I expect the papers?" she asked in a small, shaky voice. "They'll be ready in a week." "You have 5 days to get out of town," I replied, my tone unwavering. She nodded again, her gaze unfocused, lost in thought. I studied her for a moment, pale, drained, and finally realizing the magnitude of what she'd destroyed. A small, bitter smile tugged at the corner of my mouth as I opened the door and motioned for her to get out. Without a word, she stepped out of the van, and I pulled away, not sparing her a second glance as I left her standing alone on the side of the road. The next morning, at exactly 10:30, Anna showed up to collect her belongings. True to my word, everything was packed and waiting for her. 5 days later, the divorce papers landed on my desk. The reason she listed? Irreconcilable differences. I couldn't help but chuckle when I saw it. A few months later, it was all over. The divorce was finalized, and I was free. Do I have regrets? Maybe a few. I regret that Anna never truly understood what loyalty means. I regret that she looked at me, the man who stood by her through everything, and decided I wasn't good enough for the shiny new image she wanted for herself. And maybe she never stopped to consider the risk she took by betraying someone like me, a man who knows what it means to fight for what he's built and defend it at all costs. Would I have tried to save our marriage? Maybe. If she'd come to me with honesty, humility, and a desire to work through things, I might have considered it. But she didn't. She threatened me, dismissed me, and treated me like I was just some hurdle standing in the way of her so-called better life. That was her choice, and my line in the sand. Now, I'm moving forward. Life will continue, and I'll face it on my own terms. Maybe I'll spend the rest of my life alone, and maybe that means I'll die alone too. But I'll take that over spending another moment with someone who couldn't grasp the basic principles of respect and loyalty.